BYUtv's animated series Tales from Outer Suburbia takes you to a land that looks familiar on the surface, but you might want to look twice, because that second look is what the story's creator intended. Australian author and illustrator Shaun Tan's book of the same name inspired the series. He's with me now from his home in Melbourne. Welcome to BYUtv Insider, Shaun.
Thank you for having me, Scout.
Okay, so tell us about Tales from Outer Suburbia. What kind of program is it, and how did it come to be?
Well, Tales from Outer Suburbia, it's a 10-part TV series. It had a very long gestation, which I guess goes all the way back to around 2007 when I started writing these strange little stories. It was very much a process of adapting the ideas from the book into the form of a narrative that runs over 10 episodes. A young family that has moved to a new suburb and has to deal with both external events, things happening around them, but mostly some unresolved grief that's not really discussed within the family, which is then processed, I guess, through a series of strange encounters with other characters and weird situations.
And how would you describe your approach to storytelling with art and pictures for people that aren't familiar with your work?
I guess all I could say is that I'm always been attracted to stories where something a little bit strange happens.
I love that. And
that strangeness brings out something in your personality that maybe you didn't know about before. So I'm interested in pranks and things like that, situations where reality shifts and then you really sort of examine your own character by how you respond to those situations. And the central question for me is always, like say a deep sea diver appears on your doorstep, or a dugong appears on your front lawn, or a strange object starts floating in the sky above you. Is your reaction curiosity or fear? And I think all of us are torn between these two poles. And I guess storytelling and image making for me is a way of trying to understand those different responses. My feeling is that the reason we tell these stories to each other is that they arm us with the imagination to then deal with things that happen in the real world, because always in the real world there's strange and weird things. Life is full of unexpected events, both good and bad events, and we need to prepare ourselves for them. So, stories are a kind of preparation for life.
Viewers will find both ordinary and extraordinary imagery in this show. Tell us about that.
A big part of this project was world building. Even though it's set in a very familiar Australian suburban environment, it's a displaced universe. It's not quite this universe. It's got a different level of reality. And a lot of the interesting exploration we did in the very long early development of this series was trying to understand when strange things happen, how strange are they? To what extent are characters surprised, and to what extent do they just accept it as normal? And I think that's an interesting question, because in everyday life, I think we accept a surprising amount of miraculous and weird things as absolutely normal. And I really wanted to explore that concept, particularly the differences between children and adults. So for children, a lot of the world is still quite a surreal experience, and having to deal with very new and startling concepts all the time. The mistake we make as adults is that we assume that we know how the world works, and we really don't. We've just gotten familiar with certain patterns that seem to work for us.
We meet some fantastical characters in this show. What meaning do they bring to the story?
I guess for me, in developing these characters, so yeah, there's things like a water buffalo that lives in a vacant lot. There's a deep sea diver wandering the streets. There is a big ball of paper floating in the sky. There's a little foreign exchange student that comes to live with a family, and he's only about this big. The interesting thing for me is that these are not greeted with shock or awe. It's almost accepted as somewhat normal, and that raises questions for the viewer naturally. Well, what do they represent? Because everybody's sort of regarding them as somewhat normal. What should I think about them? And that's, I guess, exactly the question that I want people to ask themselves. It's a question that we as a creative team are constantly asking ourselves, but never quite answering, which I think is important. I think too often in storytelling there's this drive to set up a series of questions and then provide answers, and that's considered a satisfying experience. To me, that's very unsatisfying. What's more interesting is a set of questions that linger. They still feel somewhat resolved, but we don't necessarily know what things mean, and we're therefore left to question ourselves and imaginatively interpret those experiences so that we can come up with personal answers.
Do you feel like your art teaches? In what way does your art influence?
When you're an artist, you're a conversationalist. You're not a lecturer. So art is very different from a sermon, or rather, a good sermon is not a lecture. It's a conversation. It's asking people to think about the same things that you're thinking about. It's not asking, it's just inviting. So all art is just an invitation. It's a very low pressure kind of conversation. And basically, I see all painting and writing as just pointing your finger at something and saying, what do you think of this? It's like if you saw a flying saucer appear in the sky, you wouldn't just sit there and by yourself and ponder, what does that mean? You immediately want to rush out and get somebody to look at it and have a conversation about it. You know, it's almost like you cannot stand to just be observing it by yourself.
I can't help but think as you're talking, do you think it's a good idea for parents and children to be watching this together, and maybe that gives them an opportunity to talk about what they've seen?
Yeah, I think working on the series, there was a lot of thought to, what would my kids think of this and what kind of conversations might there be when they see this. Maybe some things in the series are actually a little bit confronting too, and they might dredge up questions and open up conversations, hopefully in a productive way, that might not have happened without watching the series. I've always been of the opinion that stories don't need to be for certain age groups. They can operate at multiple levels. And I think a lot of the situations in the series, largely due to the strange, inexplicable metaphors, means that different audience members can take away different things. So I think we make too much of a deal about differences between children and adults, and we realise that there's more similarities than differences, like how we approach the world, how we deal with problems, how we react emotionally to things. We're not really different species, and so I think it would be nice if families watching this series together realise that they actually have a lot in common, or are dealing with the same kind of problematic feelings.
What's your hope for viewers as they sit down and watch Tales from Outer Suburbia?
If there's one thing I would like audiences to come away with, it would be the same feeling I get after I've finished a painting or a story is, I'll go for a little walk in my neighbourhood and I have this very energised feeling that real and strange are the same thing, which is always a nice feeling, that the real world is strange, as if I'm seeing it again as a 5-year-old. That I always like that feeling. It's kind of the feeling I'm always chasing. That things are real and strange, and as a result, they tend to be emotional. Once you come to that realization that things they're not boring and normal. They're quite interesting and strange.
Shaun Tan, thank you so much, author and illustrator of Tales from Outer Suburbia. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Scout. See you later.
Watch this imaginative animated series when you tune in or use the free BYUtv app to enjoy anytime. Thanks for watching BYUtv Insider.